The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the GALA webinar series. My name is Manuela Noske, and I'm the Communications Manager at GALA. GALA is a global nonprofit trade association that enables communication and business across languages and cultures. And yes, we are headquartered in Seattle, Washington, in the United States. Today, we're going to talk about transcreation and what the value of transcreation is for LSPs and businesses. Kristy Sakai from Supertext will be our host, but before we get to that topic, as always, I need to go over our housekeeping items. Everyone's lines are muted to cut down on any noise. If you have any technical difficulties, let me know by using your chat box, and I will work with you to troubleshoot them. If you have a slow internet connection, your audio may be disrupted. If that happens, you can use the number listed on the GoToWebinar panel to call in using your phone. We are making a recording of this presentation, and you'll be able to find it following the presentation on GALA's global website. All participants will receive a link. If you have any questions or comments, please type them into your chat box, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can with the time remaining after the presentation. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Kristy Sakai is the CEO of Supertext USA, a creative translation and copywriting agency. She grew up in the US, the UK, and Japan, and graduated from the London School of Economics before moving to Berlin and then Zurich. After a decade of working as a copywriter and transcreator, she joined Supertext as a language manager. In 2016, she spearheaded Supertext expansion into the US. From Santa Monica in California, Supertext has worked with global brands, unicorn startups, and marketing agencies to creatively adapt campaigns for international markets. She's passionate about language, multiculturalism, and beautiful writing. And now, without any further ado, Kristy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. So yeah, thank you very much for joining this webinar. As Manuela introduced me, I am Kristy Sakai. I head up Supertext's US operations. And I don't think I need to add much more to the introduction, except to say that I am currently in Santa Monica, California, and I am here to talk about transcreation today. So I'll start a little bit with Supertext and actually the background of Supertext, because that's actually quite relevant to the topic of transcreation. So we've been around for about 15 years now, and we were founded in 2005 by a copywriter, a developer, and a business guy. And the initial idea was to create a platform where clients could upload briefs, submit projects directly to us, and our team would assign the best copywriter for the job. So we actually started as what we think is the first online copywriting agency, an editing agency. And we built a network of writers, journalists, proofreaders, editors, and we were quite successful. And, apologies. I think my screen is not being shared. There we go. So what this meant for clients, there we go.
Actually, it just reversed it. I was seeing it until just now. So go back to where you were before.
Let's see. Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just. Does that work?
Yep, it looks fine to me.
Okay.
If anybody in the audience can't see it, use your chat box and let me know, but typically this should be good. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So yes, we started as an online copywriting and editing agency, and this meant that clients didn't have to go to a full-blown ad agency or marketing agency. They could access copywriters that could complete work within a certain deadline and price. And for copywriters, it meant that they didn't have to sit in hours of brainstorming meetings with clients that were still trying to figure out what they want. So this worked quite well. And after a while, we started receiving requests for translations. Because Switzerland, as tiny as it is a country with 4 official languages. And it also has a very big expat community that mainly speak English. So people would ask us to write or edit copy, and then they would want it in different languages. And so that's basically how we got into translation. And that's where I joined the company as a language manager. And so from the ground up, we actually built a network of talented creative translators. And we approach translation from a very different angle from a traditional translation agency. And actually, it took us quite a while to realize that what we were doing naturally, which is putting together briefs and using style guides, providing variants and translations, these things came very naturally to us from a copywriting angle. But we realized then that there was actually a word for it. And that word was transcreation. And transcreation has really become a bit of a buzzword in recent years, I think. And I do think that this trend will continue because as a lot of things become more and more automated, I think the flip side is that there's a greater need for translations that can really capture the target audience. So today I want to speak a little about what transcreation really means, how the process differs from translation, and what you should be looking for when approaching transcreation. And I hope that you get a sense of the value that transcreation brings to your business. So ultimately, transcreation brings together elements of translation, copywriting, marketing, cultural sensitivity to create copy that is as effective as the original. And there are some questions about the definition of the word transcreation and how it relates to things like marketing translation and other definitions. But I won't get into that now. Taos actually has a really great report on this if you're interested. But one of the interesting things that we've realized is that we've come across a lot of cases where transcreation is treated just as an extension of translation. So it's kind of like translation, but a little bit more creative, that you are a little bit freer, or sometimes it's just a little bit more expensive. And I think the notion sometimes is that the more you pay, the better quality you get. And that's, for us, not necessarily the core of transcreation, because we think that when we talk about transcreation, we should be focusing more on the latter part of the word, creation. So transcreation, we think, is all about ideas and about the writing. So we think about the creativity that went into the design and copy of a website or a marketing campaign or an app or an advertising piece. And whoever came up with the concept and wrote the original, it was created to reach your audience in the most efficient way as possible with the most impactful message. And there was always a clear intent behind the piece. So it might be that you're trying to actually sell something with the content, or maybe raise brand awareness, or increase traffic or subscribers. And very often, this information is lost at the point that the localization process is triggered. Translators tend to not receive all the information or the context that they need in order to do a good transcreation. Because for transcreation, it's really, really important that the transcreator has the same understanding of the brief as the original creator, so that they can create something just as effective in their own language. Because the goal is to make an emotional connection with the reader. You need to know, as a transcreator, what makes them tick. You need to get inside the heads of the reader and know what they respond to. And when we think about this, then realize that transcreation actually has a lot more to do with copywriting and marketing than translating, which actually isn't surprising if you think about the types of content that needs to be transcreated. So Nimsy actually produced this really great flowchart that kind of boils down the essence of what kind of content might need transcreation. And in essence, it's usually materials that came from marketing, digital, or communication teams. And this might be part of a overall branding effort or a specific marketing campaign. So something like this headline, which is just 11 words. And actually, it's a slogan that we use for some of our own digital ads. And the intent of this ad is really to make people chuckle a little bit and hopefully like it. And when people like our ad, then our team can see where we generated interest and hopefully turn them into leads. So when we transcreate headlines like this, we want to create something in a different language that has the same effect, which would be to make people laugh and click like. And something like this is really easily measurable because you have a clear performance goal. So actually the effectiveness of transcreation, you can say, is really reflected in the number of leads generated from the ad. So in that sense, it's almost not important what the words actually say, but it's the effect that we're interested in. And this is typical of something that people usually think of when we talk about transcreation. So examples of really famous slogans or product names, like Haribo's Happy World of Haribo, or McDonald's I'm Loving It. Those are really kind of well-known transcreations. But transcreations can also look something like this. So this is just a post from our blog. And as a piece, actually, it's not terribly creative. It doesn't have like a lot of wordplay, or it's not been written to be clickbait, essentially. And so the transcreation wasn't about having hundreds of ideas. It was more about writing for the target audience with the end goal in mind. And for us, in this case, the end goal was to have a post that we can send to potential clients as a link that summarizes why we're different. And also to make sure that this article ranks high when people search for certain terms, like transcreation in different languages. So when we do something like this, it's of course very important to be aware of things like cultural nuances and wordplay and idioms. They also need creative translation. But actually, a lot of transcreations like this, which is things like maybe training material or educational resources or ebooks, things that you might not always necessarily associate with transcreation. You also actually need to think a lot deeper than what's on the screen. So this is things like, is the audience's knowledge level of your product the same in all markets? So essentially, like, what is the product maturity level? And our readers, are they in the same stage of the sales funnel? And then, of course, keywords, are they even relevant for the target audience? So thinking about factors like this can make a really big difference in the way you approach the writing, both from a stylistic point of view and a content point of view. So just to kind of summarize these two types of transcreation, we do make a distinction between short and long copy. So short copy tends to be more about brainstorming ideas, collaborating with internal teams and stakeholders. It's a lot of kind of gathering ideas and then refining and revising and maybe rewriting, which is why usually it's priced by the hour. So a slogan could take days to brainstorm and develop, or a headline might take anything from like 20 minutes to 8 hours. And then you usually have lots of rounds of revisions, because we tend to find that once a client sees a few examples, they have a lot of ideas themselves. And so these revision rounds can go on for a lot longer than the initial stage. So then long copy is a slightly different thing. It's usually calculatable by the word, but more often than not, it involves some sort of short copy too. So maybe it's a newsletter, but you want to A/B test subject lines, or maybe that you have a landing page, but it has like a headline and a call to action. And so these are things that are not as highly visible as advertising short copy, but it really deserves some input. And so in this case, actually a good transcreation project manager should be able to estimate the time that it takes for the incorporated short copy along with the word-based price. So in both cases, though, localization is not necessarily the end goal, or rather translation is not the end goal. It's has a lot more to do with marketing and copywriting. And I think that's something that I've seen quite often is like a scale of translation, and you'll have maybe machine translation on one end of the scale, and then copywriting at the other end, and translation somewhere along the scale, and then transcreation somewhere between translation and copywriting. And for me, that's a little bit misleading, because the way we think about transcreation is that it's a merging of copywriting and translation. So it's not either or, but it's that sort of crossroad in the middle where there's a source text. And so you're working with kind of a defined message. Layouts are usually set. You have a very strong framework in the original. And then you take that framework and you are then within that very free to come up with your own creative ideas. And this is really a challenge for many brands, because you want to create an emotional connection in multiple languages, obviously, but you still want to speak with one voice. And that means finding a sweet spot between consistent messaging, which is something that translation strives to do, and then also local flavor, essentially, which is something more that copywriting is suited for. So the transcreator has to bring these two elements together. It's translating and copywriting and marketing and knowing cultural sensitivities, and then creating a copy that's as effective as the original. So it's actually a really tricky task, and ultimately it comes down to finding the right people and that can really occupy that space in the middle. And I think to think about that, it helps to understand the differences between translators and copywriters. So translators, they translate. They're highly educated. Usually they've studied translations for years. They have degrees and they're really interested in foreign languages. They've mastered a second language and they really care about languages. And they work with a lot of tools like this. They usually don't have to just work with one CAT tool, but they have to work with lots of different TMS systems and maybe online tools, and maybe they have their own translation memories. And they use technology to help them get faster and more consistent, and they're really tech savvy. On the other hand, copywriters write and they focus on writing well. They don't work with Trados or any CAT tools, obviously, and they don't even speak a second language often. And when they sit down to work, they start with a blank page. Their passion is really to come up with the next great idea, like a slogan or a concept, and then they want to go and win that creative award. Essentially, they are storytellers and salesmen. So for them, it's about coming up with fresh and convincing ideas that really can sell a service or a product or a message. So this is just a little summary of the differences between the two. And I think, yeah, it's kind of a different angle. They both produce text, but from different perspectives. And I think knowing this difference really helps in thinking about transcreators, because we think that transcreators are like unicorns that are a really rare species. They have to understand marketing. They have to understand their own markets. They have to be able to write brilliantly, and they have a second language. So I always think that our ideal transcreator is someone that worked as a copywriter or a marketer in their native country, and then they fell in love with someone on holiday in a foreign land, and they end up moving to this other country and learning that language, and they kind of reinvent themselves as transcreators. So they can, for example, understand a brief and do research in the second language, and they can then turn that into a brilliant copy in their own language. And then there are some translators that have a really good flair of writing. They want to find the right words in their own language, and they really want to appeal to the readers. And they happen to have all the tools of a translator, but also kind of can switch into the mindset of a copywriter. And it's really not easy finding these people, because from experience, we found that in most cases, it's a matter of you either have it or you don't. So of course, talent isn't everything. There's a lot more involved, but we've really seen that a lot of the times translators struggle with the idea that transcreation isn't just about doing creative translation or increasing quality. I think it's a mindset because they are trained to want to understand the writers of the original content. And so they tend to focus more on that rather than getting into the minds of the reader. So traditional translation agencies and teams, I've also heard that they try to go into transcreation, or they think that they have a transcreation service, but they also face similar difficulties in switching, as a translator does, into that mindset. For example, quality measurements or ratings, they aren't always friendly to texts that really deviate from the original. And so the tendency is to stick more towards traditional translation, even though it's meant to be a transcreation, because it performs better in terms of their quality ratings. Their setting up for projects are also not always in a way that encourages creativity. So CAT tools, for example, they're not always designed to facilitate transcreation. So these are kind of the challenges that it takes to really find good transcreators and a good transcreation process. And as for copywriters, it's not always easy to find copywriters that speak a second language, and if they don't understand all the nuances of the original, then it might be difficult to be consistent with the messaging. So one thing that we really think will help in transcreation is that we encourage people to ask the right questions. So this might seem quite obvious, but actually it's really important to know what you need to know. So if you're working with a transcreator or with a transcreation team or service, these are really questions that you should be asking, or they should be asking you. What's the core message? Who's the target audience? What are you trying to achieve? This is what will drive the transcreation. And so it's important, if you're a brand working with internal stakeholders, it's really important that you work with the marketing team closely on this. Try and get the original brief or adapt the brief for the new market, and create clear brand guidelines. And actually, it's the sense of collaboration that is innate in transcreation that leads me to talking about the value of transcreation. So I think that all of us in the localization industry strive for advocating for globalization and the role that localization plays in a company's business. So traditionally, and I hope this is changing, but traditionally, I think localization tends to be kind of the last thing in a production line. So, you know, teams can spend months and months on a new campaign, but they'll leave maybe a week to have that translated into 10 languages. And I think transcreation can play a really good kind of bridge to between kind of the localization team and other stakeholders, because it requires by nature close collaboration. So as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to work really closely with the marketing team on briefs, on branding teams, to get guidelines. And I think the content that transcreation usually is involved in can really elevate the visibility and value that localization brings. And like a lot of marketing content, the performance of the content can be usually measured through whatever the goal is. So maybe it's clicks, maybe it's views, maybe it's engagement. But ultimately, transcreated content can lead directly to sales. Just a short example that one of our French language managers mentioned. So there was a French transcreator that suggested changing a call to action on a website that said register here. And the original translation in French implied like you register here. And just by changing that call to action to I register here, so the equivalent of I register here, that alone increased registration significantly. So things like that can actually have a real impact. And it really shows the value of a strong transcreator or transcreation that understands what the original, however simple and generic, is trying to achieve. So this is one way that transcreation contributes to the bottom line of a business. But there's other ways too. So you've probably seen this. When localization teams are centralized, they often handle marketing materials, and there's a standardized, streamlined localization process for marketing materials. And that usually leads to the localized materials being sent to local marketing teams, so in-country marketing teams. And what often happens is that the local marketing teams, they end up editing quite heavily the translations that they receive. And local marketing teams are not translators, they're not editors, and they might not even be writers themselves, but they really understand their markets. And when they see translations, they know instantly when something will not work. So then they spend time in fixing the materials that they received into something that they feel that can actually be used. And what this means is that they are essentially wasting, in quotation marks, time that isn't really their job. And also what it means that all the efforts that localization teams go into managing TMs and ensuring consistency and reviewing feedback, all of that kind of goes down the drain. Or you might get, some teams reporting back and others not reporting back at all. And it becomes just a really inconsistent mess, and people don't learn from it. So usually starting out with a really good transcreation that requires minimal editing on the local marketing team's side, that can really relieve a lot of time and waste, really, and costs essentially for your company. And costs are something that come into question a lot with transcreation. But actually, transcreation is quite affordable, even though the upfront costs might seem like a lot. So usually transcreation prices, it can be more than double of normal translation costs. It might take twice as long. And yeah, it might seem like a lot of investment upfront. But if you think about the amount of money and time a brand spends in creating the original content and all the teams that are involved, from the marketing department to a branding agency, maybe they have like a social media strategist, and then what we just talked about, like the local marketing teams. If you think about engaging those people for every market, or even thinking about just hiring copywriters from scratch and going through that process, you realize that actually that's really, really expensive. And getting a really great transcreation that can be employed in markets quite quickly, it's a really affordable alternative. So there's a lot of value that transcreations bring to business in terms of costs and, well, the bottom line and sales. But actually, if you think about all the bad examples of translations that have really hurt brands, that kind of content is usually the highly visible content that transcreation is really well suited for. So any search for like bad translations or when brands got it wrong, those usually involve people not taking care of making sure that context was there, the goal was there, was communicated, and a good transcreation or transcreator should have asked the right questions before starting. And even when we think about all the examples that aren't so bad, so not bad enough for people to talk about, that's probably the bulk of the work that's out there. That's really good enough. But if you think about the fact that maybe they didn't build an emotional connection and the copy didn't quite land as it could have, then you realize how many opportunities were missed because transcreation wasn't something that was taken seriously. So we know almost instinctively that emotional connection is really essential in building a global brand. And I think transcreation is really a good value proposition for companies to build that connection with their global audience. So I hope I've kind of been able to answer some myths of transcreation and give you some food for thought and an idea of how it really adds to your company's global efforts. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Hi,
Thank
Kristy.
you very much.
We do have some questions.
Sure.
How is the work of a transcreator or copywriter validated?
Validated?
Yes.
Yes. So that's actually comes back to the process of collaboration, because well, as you know, any translation is quite or any piece of writing is really subjective. The review of that can be very subjective, especially when it comes to creative copy. And I think it really requires a lot of collaboration from marketing teams and internal stakeholders to share data on how well something did in terms of performance and if it achieved the goals that they were aiming for. So this is something I think that we have to advocate for, that there's more communication and sharing of data, performance data. That's really the ultimate validation for transcreations and copywriting. Aside from that, obviously, I think for the immediate feedback that you get is usually from local marketing teams that can say, well, it required really minimal editing, and it really fit our expectations. So I think it's a mix of kind of linguistic review and ultimately performance data.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to try and think through them all and present them all to you. It's a relatively easy one. Do you have an example of a really good transcreation job?
A French transcreation job?
No, a really good one, just generally. You mentioned the wonderful world of Haribo, any other examples that come to your mind that you feel are just excellent?
That's just excellent. I think IKEA
yes,
is often used as like, a great kind of approach how they do it. I think but I mean, transcreation kind of spans, well, this is kind of where it really lies with marketing as well. So transcreation is definitely focused on the copy, right? So that's really important, but often like whether that copy really is presented in the right way relies on things like visuals and kind of a lot of the marketing that surrounds it. So it's always a collaborative effort, but in terms of like really great overall effort, I think IKEA does a great job. Let's see if there's another example I can think of. I think Gillette has this, I think it's Best a Man Can Get, and I forget what the equivalents are, but they're very good in a lot of the languages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, those are definitely good examples. Thank you for sharing those or bringing those to our attention.
Sure.
Here's another one. Is it enough to know how to write for a copywriter or a transcreator? What about being deeply steeped or versed in the actual subject matter? Do you have to be specialized?
Yes and no. I think it really helps to know the market, right? So the target market. And sometimes that's very specific. So say it's a B2B company and your target audience is software architects that use a particular tool, and they are not necessarily homogeneous across all the different countries because maybe this tool is more mature in one country than another. Things like that really is kind of specialized, and you should know the subject matter because maybe you're talking to experts, and you're really aiming at a specific audience. So yes, I think that's definitely helpful. A lot of it is to be able to do research. That's usually something that can bridge that gap. So you don't know that subject area that well, but you know where to look for information, and really kind of dig deep into that subject. So I think it would be a mix. An experience definitely helps.
Thank you for that. Here's another good one. How would you define a well-structured brief? What needs to be in it for the transcriber to be able to run with it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've talked about like training our clients in writing briefs sometimes because they don't necessarily provide sometimes you get like 10 pages of information, and that's great, all the information is there, but it's not really what we would consider a brief. What we really think is important is to know the target audience is really important. Are we talking, because that really defines, actually the target audience is really like the number one thing that we really want to know, because that also defines like everything from the language that we use, like how familiar, how formal, and the tone of the piece. So that's, and then also to know how to position the company. So as we just said, like maybe it's software architects or like technical people, and if we don't know what stage they are in the sales funnel, for example, we don't know how to approach them, because someone that is say they visited the website 10 times is different from like when you're cold approaching someone. So target audience is important. And well, in terms of the brief structure, I can kind of go over generally how we usually structure the brief. First, we have the background. So we want to set the scene. And that's just a short paragraph that gives the bigger picture. For example, this company is relaunching this product. This product is aimed at these people. So far, like the product did this, and these are the new features that are in the new version. And then we'll go on to objectives. So what are we trying to achieve with this? And sometimes that's, as I said, really measurable. So maybe they're looking for registrations, maybe they're looking for subscribers or clicks. But other times it could be educational. So if it's a post, maybe like the objective is to educate the audience on this and this and this. They should come away with this information. And then obviously the target audience is really important. What we talked about. We also try and understand where the content is going. So is it on a blog that the company runs? Is it sometimes it's printed, rarely nowadays, but sometimes it is. Are they banners maybe that are going to appear in certain publications online? So the placement and kind of the media that it's being used for, that's important. And then structural limitations. So how long should it be? Are there character counts? And is there anything in terms of the layout that we need to know about? Those are the main things that we really try and understand before we start any transcreation.
Thank you. Thank you for laying that out, Kristy. We got one viewer saying, and I think it may be a good question, saying that they're still kind of unsure what any of this really has to do with translation. If we're really talking about creation, could you just reiterate where translation comes in at all, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, you are starting with a source text. That's really important, because that source text is essentially a really important part of the brief. So the transcreation, the creation part is more in the writing, but maybe it doesn't necessarily mean that you go crazy in terms of like structure. So if it's long copy, especially, then you're starting off with, say you have 4 paragraphs and each paragraph has a subline and maybe there are some bullet points. And you have that structure in front of you, and you are going to deviate from that only if it makes sense for the target market, right? But usually you're going to have that structure to follow. And that's a really big difference between translation and copywriting, because a copywriter will actually just start with maybe a topic, and it's up to them whether it has 3 paragraphs, 8 paragraphs, if there's no headings at all. That's kind of the copywriter's discretion. So I think that's one big distinction to make. And then in terms of short copy, it is less to do with translation. But I think ultimately, like, every translation is kind of a creative endeavor, right? Because you're always like, no translator is going to be trying to just do a word by word translation. So I think that's not why I'm saying that that's what translation is, but I think there is definitely an element of or more of like creation than that in transcreation.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions here around measuring transcreators' productivity and ultimately with the payment. Let's see if we can tackle those first. So in terms of a transcreator's productivity, how do you measure how many words a transcreator can do on a daily basis? And let's start with long copy. I mean, how do you know how much they should be able to produce?
Yeah, so I think with long copy, we usually say maybe sorry, I might be completely off, but I think we calculated about 300 words, no, 175 words an hour just for long copy, which is significantly less than translation. The numbers might be slightly wrong, but generally long copy, we think that it takes maybe twice the time that it does to do a standard translation. And in terms of hourly rate for short copy, this is something that requires a lot of discussion with the client. So we have maybe standard, like a headline, maybe half an hour, a slogan, maybe 3 hours. Those are kind of the initial like starting points, and then building from that, like a lot of the revisions on top. But it really kind of depends on how much time we invest, because it is similar to copywriting in that sense that, like, a client might really just love the first idea, or you might have to spend 100 hours until you get something that they like. So usually we start with a baseline of how many hours we'll invest with the client and come to an agreement and work with that.
Thank you. We got one question that may be of general interest, and that is, how do you handle transcreation for marketing materials that would be used in more than one market? So French for France and French for Canada.
We actually make that distinction because that they tend to be different target audiences. So it's not just the language. Maybe it matters more with transcreation content because, yeah, it's very specific to market. So a lot of variations do come in. We'll have projects that are for very specific Latin American markets. So yeah, the better they're defined, actually, the better the results will be. So there's probably some overlap that can be shared, but I think if you really want to reach a certain market, it's worth investing that time and money into it. Yeah.
Yep. French Canadian speakers have different frame of reference from French speakers in France, right? Yeah. All right. Thank you. One question here It's a bit more technical, and that is if you have to use a CAT tool for transcreation, what would your recommendation be? So not to endorse any particular product, but what do you have experience with? What do you think is generally a good solution?
For transcreation?
Yes.
Yeah. I actually don't have like one particular tool that I would recommend, but one thing that we do for creative projects where we still really want to have things in a TM, we will do paragraph segmentation. So that means instead of segmenting line by line, you put one paragraph into one segment, and within that there's maybe like 5 sentences in one segment, but that means that the transcreator can be much more free to write the transcreation in a way that doesn't have to follow the structure of the original. And so I would look for a tool that allows for that if you're looking specifically for a transcreation tool.
Thank you. And we got one last question here, and it will be a great question for a panel discussion. So I'll put it out in the understanding that you may not be able to do it full justice. Why commoditize transcreation by charging by the word or by the hour? Why not find a way to price the project according to the value that it has for the client?
Oh, yeah. There is an element of that. I mean, as I said, we started as a copywriting agency, and a lot of copywriting is really about the value, right? So if Nike's slogan that, just do it, it's been like how much value does that slogan have for Nike? And if you're going to come up with that kind of thing for a brand, then yeah, it's worth a lot.
Worth a lot. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I do think that there's definitely room for thinking more in that direction.
Yes.
Yeah, and I
Definitely.
think it's our kind of job to persuade agencies and brand and the value that like being a global brand really has.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Well, we should make that part of a panel discussion that we have on transcreation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kristy. This has been super. But we have to close because we only have 2 minutes left. So thank you so much for taking us through that. Thank you to the audience for all of the questions that you have. They were great questions. If you have just a moment of your, please give a feedback on the session today by using the post-event survey. It is super short. I've started getting used to using the word super. It's very short, but your perspectives really help us to continue to refine our webinar. So super job, Kristy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I wish you all a good day or a good night, depending on where you are. And I hope to see you at another GALA webinar soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.